The dust swirled like angry ghosts around the lone figure stumbling through the merciless desert heat. Maria clutched her swollen belly with trembling hands, her lips cracked and bleeding, eyes scanning the endless horizon for salvation that would never come. Behind her, the hoofbeats had long since faded, leaving only the whisper of wind through sage and the vultures circling overhead like patient harbingers of death. Her water had run out hours ago. The sun hammered down without mercy. Each step forward felt like sinking deeper into her own grave. She collapsed to her knees, pressing her face against the scorching sand, feeling the life inside her growing weaker with each labored breath. In the distance, a shadow moved across the barren landscape, too far to be hope, too close to ignore. Her vision blurred as consciousness slipped away like water through desperate fingers. But what happened next would silence the entire prairie and prove that even in the most desolate places, miracles still walked among the forgotten. 3 days earlier, Maria Santos had been the beloved wife of Don Ricardo's foreman, living in a small adobe house on the sprawling Esperanza Ranch. Her husband, Miguel, had died in a stampede just 2 months ago, leaving her alone with their unborn child and the crushing weight of grief. She kept to herself, tending her small garden, mending clothes for the other ranch hands, finding solace in simple tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind from wandering to darker places. The morning sickness had been brutal, but she endured it with quiet dignity, the way her mother had taught her to face all of life's hardships. Don Ricardo had always been kind to her, often stopping by to check on her welfare, bringing supplies from town, treating her like the daughter he'd never had. She trusted him completely, believed in his goodness, never imagining that beneath his gentle exterior lurked a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attack came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon when the ranch hands were out moving cattle. Don Ricardo appeared at her door with flowers and sweet words, his breath thick with whiskey and desire. When she politely declined his advances, his mask of kindness shattered like glass against stone. He grabbed her roughly, his fingers digging into her arms, his voice turning cold and threatening. She fought back with everything she had, scratching at his face, screaming for help that would never come. When she finally broke free and ran toward the main house, she knew her life at the ranch was over. Don Ricardo's wife Elena had seen everything from the window, not Maria's desperate flight, but what appeared to be a calculated seduction. The accusation came swift and brutal. Maria was a harlot who had tried to seduce the patron while carrying another man's bastard child. Within hours, the lie had spread through the ranch like wildfire. The other women turned their backs on her, whispering behind their hands about the shameless widow who couldn't even wait for her husband's body to grow cold. Elena Santos, the patron's wife, stood in the courtyard like a queen pronouncing judgment, her voice carrying across the compound with crystalline authority. She declared that no decent Christian woman would tolerate such behavior under her roof, that Maria's presence was a stain on the honor of every family at Esperanza Ranch. The foreman, who had once been Miguel's friend, now looked at her with disgust and disappointment. Even the children she had taught to read turned away when she tried to speak. By sunset, her few belongings had been thrown into the dust outside the ranch gates. Don Ricardo watched from his window as she gathered her scattered possessions, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. No one offered her water for the journey. No one asked where she would go. They simply watched as she walked into the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back and death growing in her belly. The first night alone in the wilderness nearly broke her spirit completely. She had walked until her feet were bloody, following what she hoped was the old trading route toward the nearest town. But the path had long since been reclaimed by shifting sands and desert winds. She huddled against a boulder, listening to the coyotes howling in the distance, feeling the baby kicking restlessly inside her as if sensing the danger they faced. Her water pouch held perhaps 2 days' supply if she was careful, but the nearest settlement was at least 4 days away on foot. She pressed her hands against her belly and whispered prayers to the Virgin Mary, begging for protection for the innocent life growing inside her. The desert night was surprisingly cold, and she shivered in her thin dress, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. When dawn came, she forced herself to stand and continue walking, even though every instinct screamed at her to lie down and let the desert claim what it would. But her will to protect her unborn child proved stronger than despair. By the second day, the sun had become her enemy. It beat down with merciless intensity, turning the air itself into a furnace that seared her lungs with every breath. Her lips cracked and split, her tongue swollen and useless in her mouth. She rationed her water carefully, allowing herself only small sips when the dizziness became too overwhelming to ignore. The baby had stopped kicking, lying still and quiet in her womb, and that silence terrified her more than the vultures now following her steady progress across the wasteland. She stumbled and fell repeatedly, her hands and knees scraped raw against the rocky ground, but each time she forced herself back to her feet. Behind her, the wind erased her footprints as if she had never existed at all. Ahead lay only more sand and stone and the cruel promise of an empty horizon. When the last drops of water disappeared down her parched throat, she knew she was walking toward her grave. Still, she continued, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant accepting that her child would die with her in this God-forsaken place. The farmer found her collapsed beside a dried creek bed on the third morning, her dress torn and stained with blood, her body curled protectively around her unborn child like a broken bird shielding its nest. Thomas Mackenzie had been checking his irrigation channels when he spotted what looked like discarded clothing in the distance. As he drew closer, he realized it was a woman, young, pregnant, and barely alive. Her pulse was thread-thin, her skin burning with fever and dehydration. Without hesitation, he lifted her carefully into his arms, her weight alarmingly light, and carried her back to his modest farmhouse. His own wife had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, taking their son with her, leaving him alone with his grief and his failing crops. He had sworn never to let another woman suffer the way his beloved Sarah had suffered. As he gently laid the unconscious stranger in his bed and began the delicate work of saving her life, he had no idea that his act of mercy would soon bring the full fury of Don Ricardo's vengeance down upon his quiet farm. Water first, then broth, then careful spoonfuls of milk mixed with honey. Thomas worked through the day and into the night, bathing her fevered skin with cool cloths, forcing small sips of liquid past her cracked lips, monitoring the faint flutter of life in her belly. She drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words in Spanish that he couldn't understand, her hands instinctively protecting her womb even in her delirium. When she finally opened her eyes on the second day, she stared at him with a mixture of fear and bewilderment, as if kindness itself had become foreign to her experience. He introduced himself gently, explaining how he had found her, assuring her that she was safe now. She began to weep then, great silent tears that spoke of losses too deep for words. Between sobs, she told him her story, the ranch, the false accusations, the exile into the desert. Thomas listened without judgment, his weathered hands gentle as he helped her sip another cup of broth. When she finished speaking, he made a promise that would change both their lives forever. No one would harm her or her child while there was breath in his body. But kindness in a harsh land rarely goes unpunished for long. Word of Maria's survival reached Don Ricardo within days, carried by traveling merchants who had seen a pregnant woman at the Mackenzie farm. The rancher's fury was volcanic and immediate. How dare this insignificant dirt farmer interfere with his justice? How dare he shelter the whore who had tried to seduce him and then fled like a thief in the night? Don Ricardo's pride had been wounded by her rejection, his reputation threatened by her potential testimony. If she lived, she might tell others what really happened in that adobe house. If she gave birth successfully, the child would stand as living proof of his failure to break her completely. He gathered his best men, not the gentle ranch hands who might show mercy, but the hard-eyed drifters who worked for coin rather than conscience. They would ride to the Mackenzie farm and finish what the desert had failed to accomplish. But they would be subtle about it, claiming legal authority, painting Thomas as a criminal harboring a fugitive. No one would question the word of Don Ricardo Santos against that of a failed farmer and a pregnant vagrant. The morning of reckoning came with thunderclouds gathering on the horizon and the scent of rain heavy in the air. Thomas was helping Maria walk slowly around his garden when they heard the drumbeat of approaching hooves. 8 riders topped the rise, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Don Ricardo rode at their head, his silver spurs gleaming in the morning light, his face a mask of righteous indignation. They surrounded the farmhouse in a practiced formation that spoke of military training or outlaw experience. Thomas stepped protectively in front of Maria, his hand moving to the ancient rifle leaning against his porch rail. The rancher dismounted with theatrical flourish, his boots hitting the ground with authority, his voice carrying across the yard like a judge pronouncing sentence. He accused Thomas of harboring a known criminal, a woman who had stolen from the ranch and seduced married men before fleeing justice. The lies rolled off his tongue like honey. But Thomas Mackenzie had not survived 5 years of drought and loss by backing down from bullies, no matter how well armed they might be. He stood his ground, his voice steady despite the odds against him, and called Don Ricardo's accusations what they were, the desperate lies of a man trying to cover his own crimes. The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut, as hands drifted toward gun butts and horses shifted nervously beneath their riders. Maria stepped forward then, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her voice clear and strong despite her recent ordeal. She looked directly at Don Ricardo and spoke the truth that he had hoped would die with her in the desert. She described the attack in his house, his drunken advances, his violent rage when she rejected him. She spoke of Elena's willingness to believe the worst rather than face the truth about her husband. As her words hung in the morning air, even Don Ricardo's hired guns began to shift uncomfortably, recognizing the ring of truth when they heard it. The rancher's face flushed red with fury and embarrassment, his hand dropping to his pistol as he prepared to silence her testimony forever. And in that moment of ultimate tension, when violence seemed as inevitable as the approaching storm, a miracle took the form of an unexpected witness. Father Miguel Cordero had been riding the circuit between isolated farms and settlements when he heard the confrontation from the road. The old priest had known both Don Ricardo and Maria for years, had performed her wedding ceremony to the late Miguel Santos, had heard her confession just days before her exile from the ranch. As he rode into the yard, his weathered face grave with understanding, both sides froze in recognition of his moral authority. Don Ricardo tried to maintain his fiction, appealing to the priest's sense of justice and order. But Father Cordero had lived too long and seen too much to be fooled by pretty words and false righteousness. He had suspected the truth from the moment he heard of Maria's sudden exile, had spent sleepless nights praying for guidance about how to help her. Now God had delivered him to the right place at the perfect moment. With quiet dignity, he dismounted and walked to Maria's side, his presence instantly transforming the confrontation from a potential massacre into a moral reckoning that would be remembered for generations. The priest's words fell like hammer blows on an anvil, each syllable carefully chosen to strip away lies and reveal truth. He spoke of Don Ricardo's reputation among the women of the region, the whispered stories that had reached even the confessional, the pattern of predatory behavior that the rancher's wealth and position had allowed him to hide. He testified to Maria's character, her devotion to her late husband, her reputation for virtue and kindness among all who knew her. As he spoke, the storm clouds overhead seemed to pause in their journey, as if heaven itself was listening to this reckoning. Don Ricardo's hired guns began to look uncomfortable, some even ashamed, as they realized they had been prepared to kill an innocent woman and her unborn child to protect a rich man's guilty secrets. The rancher himself grew more desperate with each passing moment, his lies crumbling like sand castles before the tide of truth. When Father Cordero finished speaking, he reached into his saddlebags and withdrew something that made Don Ricardo's face go white as cemetery marble. Subscribe now to discover what the priest had hidden in those leather bags, evidence so damning it would destroy a powerful man's empire with a single revelation. In his weathered hands lay a letter written in Don Ricardo's own hand, confessing to crimes that went far beyond attempted assault. The document had been left with Father Cordero months earlier, sealed and forgotten, written during one of the rancher's drunken bouts of guilt and self-loathing. It detailed not only his attack on Maria, but a pattern of abuse stretching back years, names of other women he had violated, bribes paid to silence victims and their families. The priest had never opened it, bound by the seal of confession, but Don Ricardo's public lies had released him from that obligation. As he held the letter aloft, the rancher's carefully constructed world began to crumble. His own men stepped back, unwilling to be associated with such villainy. The storm that had been gathering all morning finally broke, sending down sheets of rain that seemed to wash the very air clean of deception. But the most powerful revelation was yet to come. Maria reached into the pocket of her torn dress and withdrew a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside was a photograph, not of her family, but of Elena Santos as a young woman standing beside Maria's own father at their wedding 23 years ago. Elena was Maria's older half-sister, a fact that Don Ricardo had discovered and used to torment his wife during their frequent arguments. The accusation of seduction had been Elena's desperate attempt to rid herself of a living reminder of a living father who had abandoned her, the sister whose very existence threatened to expose family secrets that could destroy her carefully constructed social position. As this final truth emerged, Elena herself appeared on horseback, having followed her husband's war party to witness what she expected to be Maria's final destruction. Instead, she found herself face to face with the sister she had tried to murder through exile and exposure. The confrontation between the two women was heartbreaking in its intensity. One sister protecting her social position at any cost, the other fighting simply to survive and give birth to her child in peace. The climax came when Don Ricardo, his reputation in ruins and his crimes exposed, made one final desperate attempt to salvage his power through violence. He drew his pistol and aimed it at Maria's heart, determined that if he could not silence her through lies, he would silence her forever through murder. But his own hired guns turned against him, disgusted by the depths of his depravity, their weapons now pointed at their former employer rather than his innocent victims. Thomas stepped forward, his old rifle steady in his hands, and for a moment the entire world balanced on the edge of a knife. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust and blood of deception, cleansing the air for a new beginning. Father Cordero raised his hand and spoke with the authority of divine judgment, commanding Don Ricardo to surrender his weapons and submit to earthly justice. In that moment of ultimate moral reckoning, the rancher's empire crumbled to dust. His power broken by the simple courage of those willing to stand for truth against overwhelming odds. How far would you go to protect an innocent life, even if it meant standing alone against impossible odds? The answer to that question transformed a failing farmer into a hero and gave a pregnant woman the chance to raise her child in freedom. In the weeks that followed, Thomas Mackenzie's farm became a sanctuary not just for Maria, but for other women fleeing Don Ricardo's predatory network. Father Cordero helped establish a formal refuge, funded by the rancher's seized assets and supported by decent people throughout the territory who had long suspected the truth but lacked the courage to speak. Elena Santos, broken by the revelation of her husband's crimes and her own complicity, sought reconciliation with the sister she had tried to destroy. The healing between them would take years. But it began with Elena's tearful confession and her promise to help raise the child that Maria carried. When the baby was born, a healthy daughter with her father's eyes and her mother's unbreakable spirit, she was welcomed into a community united by the triumph of justice over power, truth over lies, compassion over cruelty. The child grew up hearing the story of her miraculous survival, of the farmer who risked everything to save a stranger, of the priest who chose truth over convenient silence, of the community that rallied to protect the innocent. She learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite that fear. That kindness shown to one person can ripple outward to transform an entire region. Thomas Mackenzie never remarried, but he found purpose in his role as protector and provider for those who had nowhere else to turn. His farm flourished under the blessing of righteousness. His crops growing strong, and his heart finally healing from the losses that had once seemed unbearable. Years later, when Maria's daughter asked him why he had risked everything for a woman he didn't know, he smiled and told her that he had once been lost in his own desert of grief and despair, and someone, his late wife Sarah, had shown him that love requires us to save others so that we ourselves might be saved. The desert that had nearly claimed Maria's life became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking reminders that miracles still walk among us, that even in the most desolate places, hope can bloom like wildflowers after rain. Would you have risked everything to save a pregnant woman abandoned in the desert, knowing it might cost you your life, your home, everything you held dear? The courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances continues to inspire us, reminding us that heroism is not reserved for legends, but lives within every heart willing to choose compassion over safety, truth over comfort, love over fear. Subscribe for more powerful stories of courage that changed history, and click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another tale of unexpected heroes with a twist so powerful you'll carry it with you forever.